And we're back on Generations, friends. Kevin Swanson with you today, host of the program. And with me is Dan Lucarini, who is author and speaker on the subject of worship and music in the church. He's written this book, Why I Left, the Contemporary Christian Music Movement, Confessions of a Former Worship Leader. Hey, Dan, welcome to Generations.
Hey, Kevin. It's great to be with you today.
Yeah. Hey, Dan, why don't you start a little bit with the journey that you took through contemporary Christian music and what's happened over the last 30 years or so? What's happened to the church? Seems to me that we had psalms and hymns as an important part of the church for the previous 300 years, and then come 1970, things changed.
Yes, they have. A lot of things have changed. First of all, my journey, I was saved by the Lord at age 23. Before that, I spent a lot of time as a rock musician, and then after I came to the Lord, I started to change some of the things I was doing. In other words, I learned how to drop out of the sex and drugs part of rock and roll, right? And I got my life straightened out, thank God. But what happened then is churches that we were attending, we lived in Ohio, then we moved out to Colorado in 1994, and the pastors of those churches wanted to change the way that they were doing music in their worship services, and so they asked me to help put together worship teams, praise teams, which are essentially rock and roll bands. And with my background, they thought I could help do that. That's how I became a worship leader. And in a church down in Parker, Colorado, in fact, a fairly large church down there, and went through that journey of seeing how the tools of rock and roll that I'd been trained in, how at first it looked like it was a good idea to bring that into worship, but then I saw some things that really troubled me as we went through, and that's really what the first book was about, is an expose of the issues that we saw happening that I felt that we couldn't cover up, we needed to discuss in the church rather than continue to have this big cover-up that's going on by people who say music styles are neutral, or God made all music, what's the problem? I've come to disagree with that viewpoint, and I think we've got to discuss that. So that's my journey in a nutshell.
What were those issues, Dan, that you began to discover in the lives of maybe your own family and others?
Right. Let's backtrack just a second, because the second part of the question you asked, Kevin, was what's happened since 1970.
Okay.
Around 1970, some very well-meaning Christians thought it'd be a great idea to be able to reach out to other people who, today George Barna calls them the unchurched. But back then, the idea was, let's reach out to some people and try to meet them where they're at. And one of the things we'll do is we've got to change Christian music because it's too churchy. And so we've got to go out and embrace pop music. And so the CCM industry came out of that movement in the early 1970s. And what it did was essentially it merged the latest pop music styles with Christian lyrics in an attempt to attract unbelievers. What ended up happening in the 1980s is that move to, which was well-meaning, to try to reach out to people and evangelize them. Then it started to move into the church, and folks started to say, well, why can't we just worship God with any pop music style that we feel is okay because only the lyrics matter? And what we ended up with now, 30 years later or so, is I document on my second book, Can We Rock the Gospel, is most of the evangelical churches in the United States, in fact in other countries too, have pop music as their way to worship God. And here's the problems with that in a nutshell. Number one, introducing pop music methods and styles into the worship of God has brought into the church a number of things that I don't believe, and others would agree with me, I don't believe should be affecting our Christian worship. Number one has to do with the individualistic performance styles of American Idol, which we are seeing in our churches today, where we put people on a platform. They become Christian stars. There is no place in Christian worship and assembly for that. That's a very worldly thing.
There's only one star in the worship of God, and that's God. right?
That's correct.
Man is not to be the star on the stage when it comes to God's worship. We are all together, hopefully, worshiping God himself and putting God on the throne and worshiping him. So what do we got here, a man-centered approach versus a God-centered approach, Dan?
I think so, and we have to be careful because the man-centered approach has plagued the church since the very beginning. We can go back to Paul's letters and read about the struggles they had with people coming in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, people coming into an assembly and just insisting that they had to bring what they thought was important. And Paul made it very clear it's not about each one of us. It's about coming together and preferring one another in love when we assemble together. The rock music idiom is totally opposite of that, and it's infiltrated the church with the belief that we need to have Christian stars. Yeah. And the problem is the Christian stars will step back and say, it's not about me. But, 95% of the time, it was about us when we're up there performing. And we have to go through this trying to deflect the praise to God all the time, which is the first thing that should say, maybe there's something wrong here. We also have issues, Kevin, of what comes into a church when we embrace pop music styles. The dress of young people starts to change. And then we have to compromise and say, well, it doesn't really matter what your appearance is like on the outside. It's what's in your heart that matters. Well, that's true, right?
Not really, because God's interested in every part of us, right?
Yeah, but Jesus actually said, right, that it's what comes out of the heart that defiles us, and we see that in evidence of how we behave, what comes out, and how we act. And so the bottom line issue, Kevin, that we write about and what we talk about is that there has been a tremendous offense brought into many church bodies and many church families by well-meaning Christians who are sincere that think that they've got to have pop music as part of their worship. And it offends terribly and drives people out of churches. It splits churches in an unbelievable way.
Yeah, Dan, when it comes to worshiping God, we want to come to God with the utmost fear, reverence, and respect that we can bring to him. And I wonder sometimes if we are using a form that we have learned that does not reflect a respect and reverence and an awe for anybody, but ourselves perhaps. I wonder if we can use that form in the worship of God. Do people really believe that some of these music forms used in worship expresses a fear and reverence of Almighty God?
I don't think people are really thinking about that, Kevin. I think that they just sort of go along with the leadership. Because you're a pastor of a church.
Sure.
And you know that your people are coming in to the assembly time, and they have been exposed during the week to Christian CCM artists who would disagree with what you just said, or famous authors like Rick Warren, who has a book called Purpose-Driven Life, and in which he advances the most radical ideas on Christian worship. And so your people are hearing that, they're coming together, and they're confused, I think, and a lot of them don't even think it's an issue. But here's why it's an issue. It doesn't take a scholar to figure out very quickly that, for example, the rock music style and idiom, an idiom is a way of expressing yourself, right, is antithetical in every single way as a media message format to Christian living and to the worship of God. Everything about it, from the very creation of it, and this is what we documented in the second book, Can We Rock the Gospel? Because we thought that Christians today that forget this, or young people who don't even have a clue, need to understand where this method came from and understand why that form is, I believe, incompatible with the worship and praise of the Holy God.
Let's get back to the ultimate purpose for music in the